Thumb of Michigan, August 1884. The air hung thick and sweet with the smell of cut pine and curing hay, a deceptive calm before the siege of winter. On his newly proved-up 40 acres, Tapio Ahokas was building something that made no sense. He was not building a cabin. He was building a barn, a vast and seemingly empty shell of rough-sawn timber, far larger than any dwelling needed to be. His neighbors, practical men who measured wisdom in cords of wood and bushels of corn, would stop their wagons on the muddy track to watch. Brewster Caudill, the land clearance contractor whose crews had stripped this very land of its virgin forest, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. He was a man who understood acreage, board feet, and the unsparing calculus of the county assessor. He watched Ahokas hoist another 16-foot plank into place on the enormous, hollow frame. "Ahokas," Caudill called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who signed paychecks. "You're raising a shed to live in? Or is the cabin coming after?" Tapio, a man of few words and deliberate movements, paused and looked down from his ladder. "This is the house," he said, his Finnish accent sanding the edges off the words. Caudill shook his head, a slow gesture of pity. Two other settlers, Silas Thorne and Jedediah Morse, leaned on their fence posts, sharing in the bafflement. "That's the damnedest waste of timber and land I've ever seen," Caudill continued, his voice rising for the benefit of the others. "You've doubled your footprint, man. You're wasting proved-up acreage on empty room no assessor will ever count. That's a fool's bargain. You'll be paying tax on land you can't even farm because this wooden ghost is sitting on it." The men chuckled. They saw a cavernous, unchinked shed, a structure fit for hay or horses, not for a wife and two small children facing a Michigan winter. They saw a madman, a greenhorn Finn who didn't understand the simple, brutal logic of their world. Tapio Ahokas offered no argument. He simply nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, not agreement, and turned back to his work. The rhythmic thump of his hammer resumed, echoing across the clearing. The mockery would last through the autumn. The validation would have to wait for the cold. What did this Finnish ludi builder, a man from a land of deep snow and deeper quiet, understand about the physics of a buffered envelope that a seasoned land clearance contractor and a community of hardened pioneers had missed entirely? Before we unravel the simple genius behind this strange wooden shell and witness the humbling education that winter would provide, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We dig into the forgotten histories of practical wisdom, and I promise you will learn something about heat, wind, and survival that is as relevant today as it was in 1884. Click the like button if you appreciate these stories of quiet ingenuity, and tell us in the comments, what's the most counterintuitive piece of folk wisdom you've ever seen prove true? Tapio Ahokas was not a logger, though he knew the heft and grain of a dozen species of tree. He was not a carpenter in the American sense, a man who built boxes to be nailed together and filled with furniture. He was a man whose trade was rooted in the ancient dialogue between a family and a 9-month winter. In his homeland of Finland, he had been a builder of ludi farmsteads, sprawling complexes that were more ecosystem than building. He had worked with the massive squared logs of Arctic pine, the insulating properties of packed earth, and the profound power of unheated space. His hands knew the feel of the kiln-dried timbers for the inner dwelling, the rough-hewn planks for the outer sheds, and the precise gap between them that meant the difference between survival and misery. A ludi was a village, under a single sprawling roofline, a warm human core surrounded by a cooler, protective ring of barns, storage sheds, and covered walkways. The Finnish farmer didn't step out into the blizzard, he stepped into the buffer. He and his wife Aino had come to America with their 2 children, Elias and Sophia, seeking land of their own, a place where their labor would build a legacy, not just pay rent. They bought their 40 acres in the Thumb, a flat, fertile peninsula of land clawed from dense forest, where the wind blew sharp and clean off the vast, cold expanse of Lake Huron. Their first winter in a hastily built, standard-issue settler's cabin had been a lesson in failure. It was a cold that didn't just seep, it invaded. Tapio remembered Aino, a woman of immense resilience, sitting by the fire trying to mend one of Elias's woolen shirts. The needle, chilled by the ambient air in the cabin, would not pierce the fabric. The wool fibers had become so brittle with cold that the needle point simply skidded across the surface, unable to penetrate. He remembered the sponge for washing dishes, left for a moment too far from the stove, freezing solid. When Aino picked it up, it didn't bend. It fell from her numb fingers and shattered on the floor like a piece of pottery. Most terrifying were the mornings when the iron door hinges had seized completely, frozen tight to the door frame by the moisture that had condensed and then solidified into pure steel-binding ice. For a few panicked minutes, they were prisoners in their own frigid home. They had survived, but it was a grim, huddled existence, a constant battle fought inches from a cast-iron stove that devoured wood at an astonishing rate. Tapio burned through 7 cords of oak and maple just to keep the temperature above freezing. He knew this was not sustainable. It was not living. It was a siege. He had watched his children, their faces pale, and their breaths pluming in the corners of their own home. He would not allow them to endure that again. He was not an inventor chasing a clever idea. He was a father and a husband, armed with ancestral knowledge, solving a problem that threatened to break his family. The conventional wisdom in the Thumb of Michigan was straightforward. Build tight, build thick, and cut enough wood to feed a dragon. A standard cabin was a single wall of logs, ideally squared and tightly fitted, with the gaps filled by a mixture of mud, moss, and clay known as chinking. The theory was simple. The wall was a barrier. The thicker the log, the better the barrier. The tighter the chinking, the fewer the leaks. In a calm, cold environment, this worked reasonably well. But the Thumb was not calm. Its proximity to Saginaw Bay and the larger Lake Huron produced a weather phenomenon of ferocious power. Lake effect snow. This wasn't the gentle, drifting snow of a Christmas card. It was a relentless, horizontal assault, driven by winds that could hold a steady 30 miles per hour for days on end. The problem wasn't merely the cold. The problem was the wind. The primary failure of the standard frontier cabin was a concept modern engineers call wind washing. At 30 miles per hour, the wind did not just press against a cabin wall. It created a powerful zone of negative pressure on the leeward side. This pressure differential acted like a giant syringe, actively sucking the warm air from inside the cabin right through the microscopic cracks in the chinking, around the window frames, and under the door. The settlers felt this as drafts, but it was something far more sinister. It was the wholesale theft of their heat. A family could have a fire roaring in the stove, generating thousands of BTUs of heat, only to have it vacuumed out into the Michigan winter before it had a chance to warm anything more than a few feet from the firebox. Brewster Caudle, for all his practical experience, saw the problem as one of materials. If a draft appeared, you packed in more mud. If the wall felt cold, you needed thicker logs. He, like everyone else, was fighting the battle at the surface of the wall. In his own well-built cabin, his family spent the winter in a constant state of migration, following the heat from the stove, their lives shrinking to a 10-foot circle in the center of the room. They burned a staggering amount of firewood, a testament not to their comfort, but to their cabin's inefficiency. The endless labor of felling, bucking, splitting, and stacking wood was simply the price of admission for living in the Thumb. They accepted it as a law of nature. Tapio Ahokas knew it was not a law, but a design flaw. He knew the wind was the true enemy, more so than the temperature. You could not stop the wind, but you could, perhaps, disarm it. The construction began in late August and became the season's prime entertainment. First, Tapio laid a simple stone foundation for the outer shell. It was a massive rectangle, 30 feet wide and 40 feet long. On this, he erected a post and beam frame from rough sawn pine, the kind of quick, sturdy construction used for a hay barn. The walls were single layers of vertical 1-inch planks, with no attempt at sealing the gaps. A gentle slope roof, also of planking, completed the enormous shell. It looked flimsy, drafty, and utterly inadequate as a house. Caudle mockingly called it the Finn's Wind Tunnel. Then, once the great shed was complete, Tapio began to build again, this time inside it. He laid a new, smaller foundation of carefully stacked fieldstone, leaving a uniform gap on all 4 sides between his new foundation and the inner walls of the shed. The gap was precisely measured, 28 inches. On this new foundation, he began to build his actual home, a compact traditional log cabin, 16 feet wide and 26 feet long. He worked with a patient precision that baffled his audience. The logs were smaller than his neighbors used, but he notched them with the care of a cabinet maker. He chinked the gaps meticulously, not with mud and moss, but with a mixture of clay and lime. He prepared himself, pressing it into every crevice until the walls were seamless. Brewster Caudle stopped by one afternoon, shaking his head at the sight of a finished cabin sitting inside a half-built barn. "That's 2 buildings for the price of one, Ahokus, and only one to live in," he said, gesturing at the stacks of timber. "You could have built a proper-sized house with all that wood. Instead, you've got a cabin in a crate." "It is one house," Tapio replied quietly, not looking up from his work. He was fitting the frame for the small cabin's single door. Aina watched him work, her trust in him a silent counterpoint to the community's ridicule. One evening, as the children slept in their temporary lean-to, she stood in the 28-inch corridor between the inner and outer walls. "It feels strange in here," she said, "like a hallway to nowhere." "It is a hallway for the wind," Tapio said, running his hand along the smooth inner wall. "The wind will walk this hall. It will not knock on our door." The final piece of the puzzle was the roof. The inner cabin had its own ceiling of thick planked joists. Above this, the cavernous space of the outer shed's roof loomed. Tapio built a rough framework over the cabin's ceiling, and then, to the absolute astonishment of his neighbors, began filling the entire massive cavity, a space 4 feet deep in some places, with hundreds of tightly packed straw bales from his first meager harvest. "My God, he's turning his attic into a tinderbox!" Silas Thorne exclaimed to Caudle. "One stray spark up the chimney and the whole thing will go up like a torch." They saw a fire hazard of epic proportions. Tapio saw millions of hollow stalks, each one trapping a pocket of air, creating a blanket of insulation that would dwarf anything they could imagine. The mockery had reached its peak. The Finn was not just foolish, he was a danger to himself. The physics behind Tapio's cabin in a shed were both simple and profound. He was defeating the 2 primary mechanisms of heat loss, convection and conduction, by addressing them in separate, dedicated stages. He had, in essence, built a house whose first line of defense was not a wall, but a zone of calm. The outer shed served one primary purpose. It was a windbreak of absolute effectiveness. When the 30-mile-per-hour gales of a lake-effect storm slammed into the vertical planks of the shed, their kinetic energy was dissipated. The wind stopped. Inside the 28-inch buffer zone, the air was almost perfectly still. This completely eliminated the problem of wind washing. There was no pressure differential to suck the heat from the inner cabin's walls. The drafts that plagued his neighbors simply could not form. The most aggressive weapon in winter's arsenal had been neutralized before it even reached the real house. With the air in the buffer zone calm, The only way heat could move through it was via natural convection and radiation, a far slower and less violent process than the forced convection of the wind. Over a few hours, the air in this gap would stabilize, warmed by the slow bleed of heat from the inner cabin and cooled by the frigid outer wall. It would reach an equilibrium temperature. On a night when the outside air was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the air in Tapio's buffer zone might settle at a steady 30 degrees Fahrenheit or even 40 degrees Fahrenheit. This created the second and most powerful advantage. The rate at which a building loses heat is directly proportional to the temperature difference, the delta T, between the inside and the outside. A standard cabin with an interior of 65 degrees Fahrenheit and an exterior of minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit has a delta T of 85 degrees. Every square foot of its wall is fighting an 85-degree temperature gradient. Tapio's inner cabin, however, was not losing heat to a minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit night. It was losing its heat to the calm 40 degrees Fahrenheit air in the buffer zone. With the same 65 degrees Fahrenheit interior, his delta T was a mere 25 degrees. By reducing the temperature differential by more than 2/3, he had slashed his home's heat loss by the same amount. The massive blanket of straw bale insulation above the ceiling performed the same function for the roof, creating a colossal thermal break between his living space and the sky. His small, efficient wood stove didn't have to fight a polar vortex. It only had to keep a well-sealed box warm against a cool, calm autumn day. He wasn't out-muscling the winter. He was sidestepping it. The snow began on a Tuesday in mid-January. It wasn't a storm so much as a siege. The wind locked in from the east, a raw, damp blast coming off the frozen plains of Saginaw Bay, carrying a payload of fine, hard snow that flew perfectly horizontal to the ground. For 9 solid days, the wind never dropped below 30 miles per hour, and the temperature never rose above minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a weather event that scoured the landscape, piling up drifts that buried fences and outbuildings, and finding every single flaw in human construction. For the settlers of the Thumb, it was a waking nightmare. At the Caudle House, the wind shrieked through the log walls. Brewster and his oldest son spent their days feeding the stove and their nights huddled under every blanket they owned. Ice formed in thick, crystalline ferns on the inside of the west wall, the one facing the wind. A barrel of potatoes in their root cellar, thought to be safe, froze solid. At the Thorne residence, a section of chinking failed, blowing out in the night and letting in a jet of Arctic air that felt like a physical blow. The family abandoned the main room entirely, nailing blankets over the doorway and living in their small bedroom, a grim tableau of fear and shivering misery. In the strange, double-walled house of Tapio Ahokas, there was quiet. The roar of the wind was a distant, muffled hum, the sound of a battle happening somewhere else. Inside the small, warm cabin, the air was still. There were no drafts. A single candle on the dinner table burned with a steady, unwavering flame. Aino was able to do her mending, her needle piercing the wool with ease. The sponge by the wash basin remained soft and pliable. Elias, who was 8, and Sophia, who was 5, were not bundled in coats. They sat on a woolen rug on the floor, sorting a small bag of bean seeds for the spring planting, their fingers nimble and sure. The contrast was absolute. Numerically, it was staggering. Inside Brewster Caudle's house, the temperature fluctuated wildly, reaching 50 degrees Fahrenheit near the stove, while plunging to 25 degrees Fahrenheit near the walls. In Tapio's home, a thermometer Aino had brought from the old country registered a placid and unwavering 68 degrees Fahrenheit. From the floor to the ceiling, from the wall by the door to the wall by their beds. The visual contrast was even more stark. At the Morse cabin, a tin cup of water left on a table 6 feet from the fire developed a skin of ice within the hour. On the windowsill of Tapio's inner wall, nestled in the calm air of the buffer zone, a small pot of chives that Ino babied through the winter was not only alive, it was green. The small domestic routines of life, the smell of baking bread, the sound of a child humming, continued, completely insulated from the brutal war being waged just a few feet away. On the 7th day of the siege, the brutal calculus of the cold claimed a victim. Brewster Caudle and his crew were trying to clear a brush pit near the edge of his property, a miserable task made nearly impossible by the wind. One of his draft horses, a powerful but older Belgian, weakened by the unrelenting cold in the barn and stressed by the work, simply collapsed in its harness. It shuddered once and died, its body freezing to the ground in minutes. The loss of a horse was a catastrophic blow, a loss of capital, labor, and pride. Shaken and furious at the world, Caudle sent his men home and began the grim task of protecting his remaining animals. He was hauling heavy wool blankets from his house to the barn, his face a mask of ice, his lungs aching with every breath of super-chilled air. His path took him directly past the strange, silent structure belonging to Tapio Ahokas. He paused, leaning his back against the outer wall of the shed to catch his breath, bracing for the vicious, life-stealing cold he knew from his own cabin walls. He expected the brutal shock of -18 degrees Fahrenheit wood, a cold that felt like it was actively pulling the heat from his bones. But the shock never came. The planking was cold, yes, but it was a dead, neutral cold. It lacked the vicious bite, the bone-sucking energy of every other exposed surface in the valley. It felt like a cellar wall in autumn, not a barrier against a polar vortex. All the fury of the wind was gone, stopped dead by this simple, unchinked wall. He pressed his bare, chapped palm flat against the wood. It was merely cool. Confused, he stumbled around the corner and into the 28-inch gap. The world went silent. The 30-mile-per-hour gale was reduced to a whisper. He stood there, protected, in a pocket of profound and unnerving calm. He could feel the faint warmth radiating from the inner cabin wall. He understood. He walked the few steps to the inner cabin's door and knocked. The sound was small and dull in the buffered space. Tapio opened the door, and a wave of simple, clean warmth washed over Caudle. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of an overdriven stove, but the gentle, pervasive warmth of a normal room on a normal day. He stepped inside. He saw the children on the floor, the placid candle, the pot of green herbs. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom of his own smoky cabin, took in the scene. Then he saw it. On the deep sill of the inner window sat a pair of thick gray wool socks, presumably left there to dry. They were soft, supple, and perfectly limp. Without a word, Caudle shrugged off the heavy contract bag he carried over his shoulder. He reached inside and pulled out a spare wool sock he kept for emergencies. It was frozen solid. The yarn had become a rigid, unbending material, shaped into the hook-like form it had held when he'd stuffed it in the bag. He walked over to a wooden peg on Tapio's wall and hung the frozen sock from it. It dangled there, a grotesque sculpture of ice and wool, a perfect artifact of the world he had just left. He turned to Tapio, his face a mixture of awe and shame. The mockery of the past 6 months, the confident pronouncements of waste and foolishness, all crumbled to dust. He looked around the small, warm room, at the calm, quiet reality of it. "You didn't build a cabin, Ahokas," Brewster Caudle said, his voice cracking with emotion. "You built a calm day in the middle of a storm." The conversion of Brewster Caudle, the community's most respected and vocal skeptic, was as swift and total as the winter storm. He became the Finn's most fervent advocate. The story of the frozen sock became a local legend, retold in the general store and after-church services. Caudle, a practical man, translated his newfound respect into immediate action. That spring, he began rewriting his standard land clearance contracts. Where before he would have cleared a plot clean, he now specified that stands of trees, or ideally existing outbuildings, should be left standing adjacent to the planned dwelling site, creating natural windbreaks and the potential for buffered zones. The idea spread with the speed of a prairie fire. Farmers who had once seen a ramshackle woodshed as an eyesore now saw it as the first layer of a defense. The Ahoka's buffer, or Finn shed, as it came to be known, entered the local vernacular. By the spring of 1885, families in 6 surrounding townships were adapting the principle. Some built covered walkways between their house and barn. Others built new corn cribs, deliberately oversized and placed to shield the northern face of their homes. They were retrofitting an old-world idea onto their new-world reality, and the results were immediate. Fuel consumption across the region plummeted. Tapio Ahokas's quiet innovation anticipated by nearly a century the core principles of modern building science. The concept of the buffered envelope is now a cornerstone of high-performance construction. From the rain screens that protect skyscrapers from wind-driven moisture to the double-stud walls used in ultra-efficient passive house designs. These modern methods use advanced materials, but the underlying physics is identical to what Tapio understood instinctively, that an unconditioned buffer space can dramatically reduce the thermal load on the conditioned living space within. He had built a low-tech 19th-century passive house with nothing more than rough-sawn pine, straw, and a deep understanding of the enemy. The frontier mind, by necessity, was geared toward confrontation. Survival was a direct battle fought against the elements. If the cold was the enemy, the solution was a thicker wall, a bigger fire, a stronger shield. The settlers fought the winter at their doorstep, a brutal, close-quarters combat that consumed their energy and resources. Tapio Ahokas's wisdom was of a different order entirely. His approach was not about confrontation, but about distance. He didn't build a better shield. He simply moved the location of the battle. He didn't fight the cold at his wall. He made the cold lose its teeth one room away. He conceded the outer shell to the wind and the frost, a sacrificial space that absorbed the winter's rage. By inviting the enemy into an antechamber, he ensured it could never breach the throne room. He had created an island of manufactured calm, proving that the most effective way to withstand a siege is to build a fortress so clever the enemy never even realizes where the real walls are. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity as compelling as we did, please hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you won't miss our next exploration of forgotten wisdom. We rely on your support to keep these stories alive. Please share this video with anyone who appreciates the intersection of history, science, and human resilience. And before you go, let us know in the comments, what other old-world techniques have you seen solve modern problems? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these or similar techniques in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.